Welcome to day 4 of Western Civilization. Today our focus is going to be the American Revolution, kind of the culmination of different political and social movements we've examined so far in this unit on revolution. Some notable dates to keep in mind today. 1763 is the end of the French and Indian War. 1776 is the American Declaration of Independence. 1783 is the Treaty of Paris. And 1787 is when the U.S. Constitution is drafted. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, philosophers questioned the notions of sovereignty. Now, what sovereignty is just having supreme power and authority over a specific area. Now, Locke, John Locke that is, his political thought kind of looked at sovereignty in a different way, and he advocated removing it from rulers and kind of investing it into the people, so the people have some kind of say with how they're going to be governed. Voltaire again trumpeted the need for freedom of expression and religious tolerance, and these things, these ideas are going to be extremely radical, and they're going to work their way into what will become the framework for the United States of America. Now, the American Enlightenment was an intellectual thriving period in the U.S. between the mid to late 18th century. Now, some of the notable people that were behind this Enlightenment movement in the colonies, or to become what we refer to today as the United States, were Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and so on and so forth. Now, there's trouble kind of on the horizon here in the mid-18th century. Initially, there was no sign that America would become the center of a huge revolution, because a lot of colonists saw themselves as British subjects. They obeyed British law, they obeyed the crown, they were very loyal for the most part, and even when the revolution starts to happen, you still have a good chunk of colonists or people living in North America that still consider themselves more British than American. Between 1756 and 1763, the British fought the French across the world, but more specifically, we're looking at the French and Indian War that was fought in North America. Now, this we talked about earlier, and France and Britain fought for global territories and kind of control of trade. The result of this conflict of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in North America, is that the British won. Now, what was problematic with this is that it was extremely expensive for the British, so they needed to get some money back. And so what we'll see here, and what they decided to do eventually, is get their money back through taxation of a good portion of the American colonies. So if you take a look here, I know we've seen this map before, but this is the French and Indian War. These are the pre-war boundaries of 1754. You can see the British American colonies here. The big chunk here in orange is going to be the French territory. In the Ohio Valley, this is going to be disputed territory, where eventually this buffer zone, if you will, is going to lead to conflict between these two countries. And eventually what's going to happen, by 1763 the war concludes. France is going to give over its claims in North America to Spain. That would be lands west of the Mississippi River. Their lands east of the Mississippi River are going to become British territory. Now, the British Parliament thought that the American colonies should help pay for war, and like I referenced, they're going to do this through taxation. So the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and so on and so forth. A lot of these other acts are going to nickel and dime the colonists so the British can recoup their losses. So the biggest thing the colonists are not happy with is that they resented taxation without representation. So therefore, they really don't get a say in where their money's going for, and what resources that they produce are being set aside for the British first and American colonists secondly. Now, leading to the road to war, the Sons of Liberty organized chapters across the North, and they opposed what they considered to be British abuses of power. Now, high taxes, of course, also just the overall cost of kind of following the government led to a lot of big issues within this period. 1770 was the Boston Massacre. All right, and eventually 1773, the tea tax and the Boston Tea Party. So we're going to see that there is brewing tension between the colonists and the British, and eventually this tension is going to spill over and become a full-bore revolution, and then it's going to become an actual war for independence. Again, if you take a look at this, this is an engraving, or a copy of an engraving, from the Boston Massacre in 1770. There is a reading for today that's going to give you kind of the background information about what happened during this event. So keep in mind that what I'm portraying to you is just kind of a overview, a quick survey of the American Revolution. Alright, so like I referenced, in 1773, a lot of the American colonists boycotted the British by boycotting British products, and in some cases attacking British officials. Okay, one example that we'll look at is the Boston Tea Party, and what happened because of this is that the British repealed all taxes except for this one, but the Americans still rebelled. They wanted all or nothing. So as the Americans become a little more organized, eventually what's going to happen is the American colonists are going to organize into the First Continental Congress in 1774. So George Washington joined as a delegate from Virginia. All right, and Lexington, the Battle of Lexington, is going to ignite the war between Britain and the colonies. It's going to be the shot that's heard around the world. Okay, the Continental Congress in 1775 is later going to appoint George Washington, who during the French and Indian War, mind you, served under the British. But in 1775, George Washington is appointed as the commander-in-chief of the what will become the Continental Army. Here's a very notable quote that I like to include in this point. It kind of encapsulates some of the ideas and perceptions of the American colonists. Okay, and it goes, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death." And this was spoken by Patrick Henry in 1775. So we can see that this call for freedom is becoming very, very noble. What we see is people are going to willingly lay down their lives in order to have this liberty. July 4th, 1776, there's a unanimous Declaration of Independence from Britain, and in this we see rumblings and evidence that all men are created equal. We'll get into if that's actually truly all men or not. In addition, certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and governments derive their consent from the governed. All of these ideas are going to be derivatives from Enlightenment ideas that were produced prior to this event. So some of the central ideas within this, the desire to move away from abuses of power, self-evident truths, equality, rights, consent of the governed, and the right to overthrow the government if it's not effective. Now, some of the limitations within the Declaration of Independence and other documents of the age are some of the limitations. So slavery really wasn't addressed. Elite white males were the leading individuals in terms of who had a say and who was getting a lot of the benefits from this. The poor were excluded, the women were excluded, and it wasn't kind of a public document. It was more or less secretly composed. Now, the early onset of the war, the British Army was very strong. It was, in fact, the world's most powerful army and navy. And they had the largest empire in the world. So really, on paper, the British should have totally decimated the American Rebellion. Now, in the colonies themselves, about 20% of the white population were loyalists or Tories who remained loyal to the British monarchy, while the other 80% were more what they could call American, and they were developing that kind of nationalistic identity. Now, looking at the two contenders before we go to war here, Britain was extremely wealthy. They were very confident. They had a professional army, incredible firepower, grand navy. But some of the stuff that really stood in their way were some of the distance and supplies. Now the colonists, on the other hand, they knew the general layout of the land. They had the home field advantage. It was a defensive war. The French supported them. Population was dispersed, so it was a little bit of everybody everywhere. The size of the region was rather large. All right, and they had a lot of local Minutemen or militias that fought for this movement. Now, if we look at the phases of the war, there's about 3 different phases that happen, and I'll talk about those rather briefly here. The North, 1776 and 1777, rebel victories, and this is going to boost morale that the Americans are going to, or the colonists, I should say, they're going to overcome and have success against this incredible British Army and Navy. Okay, so much that they convinced international support from the French in 1778 and 1779 from the Spanish. Now, as time kind of goes on, the South is a different tide. It changes a little bit. There's more loyalist support down there, and so what we see is that is a location where the British kind of have their foothold in North America and start to work their way a little further north. Now, in the end, the British really fail to hold tight for rural areas, and eventually the British are surrounded in 1781, and the war is going to end eventually in 1783 with the Peace of Paris. So the difficulties for the British that kind of led to their defeat, it was a war across the Atlantic. Supplying soldiers took an incredible amount of time, energy, and money, where the rebels were supported by other European states that were enemies to Britain itself, so France, Spain, Netherlands, German states, so on and so forth. Now, like we talked about, the final battle happened in Yorktown, Virginia, where the British surrendered in 1781, and eventually the Peace of Paris is signed in 1783. And this is where Britain is officially going to recognize American independence. So if we take a look here, this is where we're going to have the 13 original colonies in 1775. And just take a second, kind of pause this lecture and look at the map, and take a second to kind of see what the original land masses look like compared to kind of what they look like today. Some are going to be very similar, and some are going to be dramatically different. Okay, 1783, a little bit of time goes by, and you can see that the American colonies that started here on the East Coast are starting to move more westward. And eventually this is going to be a theme that's going to keep going all the way until really the 20th century. So the aftermath of the American Revolution, leaders of the newly free American state created a country founded on Enlightenment principles. Okay, 1787, the Constitution was drafted as a blueprint for the country. The government was based largely on popular sovereignty, guaranteed individual rights for men of property and privilege. But there were some people that were definitely left out of this equation. And eventually they're going to spend a good chunk of our modern American history kind of battling for their individual rights. Some other general conclusions: 70% of those signing the Declaration held offices in British colonial government. And the shift from British control in North America went more so towards control by these new American elites. So really the existing framework of kind of this Eurocentric white dominance, it really doesn't change hardly at all. It's just different rulers in place. And the United States is more of a sovereign nation that's going to experience its own trials and tribulations as a country in its infancy. But really it's not going to be anything dramatically different than what happened before when there was British occupation. Okay, that concludes our discussion on the overview of the American Revolution. Tomorrow we will study the French Revolution, and we'll see how the American Revolution, along with Enlightenment ideals, influence the French Revolution. Thanks for tuning in.